You can see what kinds of things people were talking about at the conference. He really visited a bunch of different sessions and wrote up this like 4-page report on what was discussed and what state of the field. It was really cool. Yeah.
I don't remember it, except that I think Robert's Tory, I think I gave him guest quarters.
Oh, was Robert there too? Oh, that's great.
Someone stayed in my guest room, I think.
Yeah. That's when I first met Isabel. I remember I was a grad student. Yeah.
Well, good luck. Looking forward to it. And thanks for letting me practice being on stage.
There you go.
I'll be chairing a session on memory a little bit.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, good to see you, Andrea.
Okay, so comments saying that somebody should curate together all the blogs written about this conference for posterity too. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
What a cool idea. Yeah, that's a really cool idea. I mean, it's just, I wish I had a copy of the proceedings from the 1992. It's like a phone book, it's like one of these, like back when it was actually, everything was still printed. I mean, there weren't that many people, I guess, compared to now. In fact, do you have any numbers? Do you know approximately how many people are registered?
It's in, actually that will be shown later tonight when we have the closing session, but I think we have definitely around 600.
Fantastic.
Around 600.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you may not have any idea, but I'm just curious how many presentations roughly, if you combine posters and talks. Sorry, I didn't mean to bug you with these numbers.
Well, it's quite a lot actually.
It's a lot, right?
I don't know. It's 60 pages, wow. PDF, and each page has about 10 to 12. So.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a lot of growth.
Yes. And Shantala says 26 institutes represented from India, which is the first.
That was amazing.
Yeah. So we're all live on YouTube.
Okay.
So I'll start in a minute. I'll introduce you and then.
All right. Thank you.
All right. So, okay. So right on the dot. Welcome everyone to our invited keynote. And before I introduce our speaker, I would request you all to please wait until the end of the talk to type in any questions you have for him in the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Professor Aniruddh Patel. Aniruddh Patel is a professor of psychology at Tufts University, where he studies the cognitive, neural, and evolutionary foundations of musicality. He received his PhD in organismic and evolutionary biology from Harvard University. Well, that's a mouthful to say. And then worked for 15 years at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego, California, where he was a senior fellow before joining Tufts. His areas of emphasis include music-language relations, and that's also the topic of his 2008 book, Music, Language, and the Brain, Rhythmic Processing, and Cross-Species Studies of Music Cognition. A wide variety of methods are used in this research, including brain imaging, behavioral experiments, theoretical analyses, acoustic research, and comparative studies with non-human animals. Wow, that's a lot of very, very fascinating and interesting work. And Dr. Patel has served as president for the Society for Music Perception and Cognition and is a fellow in the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness program in the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. So, well, today we have him presenting on a topic befitting the theme of the conference in his talk titled Measuring and Modeling Melodic Expectation Using Singing, Surprising Findings and New Opportunities for Cross-Cultural Research. So welcome, Professor Patel. The stage is all yours. So
thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen and see if everything is working. Okay. Back to here. Whoa. Okay, so can you see my screen now? I can't see you. I can only hear you. Can you? Everything okay, Vinu?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, well, first of all, thank you to Renee and Vinu and Shantala and others who helped organize ICMPC for this invitation to speak. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm happy to be telling you about this work on measuring and modeling melodic expectation using singing. First, I just want to say a word to students who are entering the field. If this is your first ICMPC, just welcome to the field. It's an exciting time to be joining this field. My first music cognition conference was an ICMPC, the second one in UCLA in 1992 as a grad student, and it had a really big impact on my career. And so we're looking forward to your future contributions to the field. And a moral of today's talk for students is that if you help develop a new tool or research method, it can lead to discoveries you never anticipated. So in other words, never underestimate the power of serendipity, as I hope to illustrate today. And also, useful new methods don't have to be fancy or expensive. So I want to start by thanking collaborators and funders, the original team that worked on the melodic closed probability paradigm. It's a wonderful interdisciplinary team. Alison Fogel was my PhD student, Jason Rosenberg, a composer, Frank Lehman, a music theorist, Gina Kuchenberg studies language in the brain, Anjali Nair was an undergraduate, one of my advisees, and Emily Morgan is a computational linguist, kind of illustrating the wonderful diversity of the field of music cognition. In terms of the online melodic closed study that I'll talk about, Nori Jacobi and Luke Puppel were central to that, and that was work funded by the Max Planck Society. And for the work I'll talk about on comparative musical and linguistic expectancy research, a really great team, Chen Zhao, Li Wang, Jinqi Hu, Kunbin Zhang, and Fang Liu. And that work was funded by the ERC. All right, so let's just start with a general observation that most music cognition research has focused on instrumental music, and there are many good reasons for this. It can be precisely controlled and manipulated for perception studies, but as a result, singing is actually an undertapped domain for cognitive research on music. And it's worth reminding ourselves that singing is a universal and ancient human behavior. So some cultures have no musical instruments, but all cultures have song. And adults with no musical training often enjoy singing. So it's probably the most widespread human musical behavior. And actually, it likely predates the oldest known instruments. We know from archaeology that the oldest instruments are around 40,000 years old. And singing almost certainly long predates that, since it just doesn't fossilize. Song-like behaviors emerge early in life. They don't require special training to emerge. I just want to point out one really neat study in this regard. Benetti and Costagiomi in 2019 published a case study of 16 hours of continuous recording of a 15-month-old infant. And this was possible thanks to these new technologies, like this little vest that this infant is wearing that has a built-in recorder that records continuously. And that allows them to just study the infant's own musical productions, even when no one is around. And they found that the infant imitated parts of songs heard hours earlier. The infant, of course, used nonsense syllables, but one of the imitations was noticed by the father, who actually recognized it and sang it back, meaning there was enough information in the pitch contour and the rhythm and so forth for the father to recognize the song. The other imitation was completely unnoticed by the parents, showing that you can capture things that just are not observed otherwise. Also see Mendoza and Fosse's new paper in Developmental Science, where they used a similar technology to do day-long recordings from 35 infants aged 6 to 12 months. And I think we've just scratched the surface of what we can learn about musical development with this technology. Another neat thing about singing is it's a behavior we share with many species, unlike instrumental music. And that creates opportunities for cross-species research on musical structure to test hypotheses for why certain aspects of musical patterning are widespread. So for example, in a 2011 paper, Adam Tierney, Frank Russo, and I tested hypotheses regarding how motor constraints shape pitch patterns in music by comparing bird song and human song. And then later on, that work was extended by Pat Savage and Adam and myself, looking at global musical samples. Okay, so singing is also a rich area for exploring fundamental issues in music cognition. So for example, what are the universals of human music cognition? This has been studied recently by Nori Jacobi and colleagues in a remote part of the Bolivian Amazon, working with the Chamane tribe. And they're using a singing paradigm that involves singing back two-tone pitch intervals that are played to participants either outside or within the listener's vocal range. So let's take a look at a little clip from their research. You'll see Nori here doing this experiment with a participant. Okay, so it's a nice simple task that ports well across cultures. Just listen to this, these two notes and try to imitate them the best you can in your comfortable singing range. What they found was that mental scaling of pitch intervals is logarithmic, even in this very remote culture, just as it is in every other culture we've studied. But unlike US participants, including non-musicians, the Tsimane don't show octave equivalence. That is, when they do this task, they match the intervals in terms of logarithmic size, but not the chroma. And that sort of challenged a long-held belief about the octave equivalence as a universal of human music cognition. And there's some interesting debate about that now. Interestingly, the Tsimane normally sing solo in their traditional music. They don't sing collectively, raising the possibility that perhaps octave equivalence only emerges when people sing in groups and coordinate their pitches. This is an idea I discuss in a forthcoming paper, short commentary in behavioral and brain sciences with Chris von Rooyen, an anthropologist who's studied the Tsimane for many years. Another fundamental issue that can be explored through singing in terms of music cognition are what are the cognitive relations between speech and music processing? In the song illusion, certain spoken phrases, when looped, are vividly perceived as sung. This was discovered by Diana Deutsch, one of the founders of our field, and published first in a 2011 paper in JAZA. And this demonstrates that speech and music do not always have different acoustic attributes. So they can actually be distinct listening modes applied to identical sounds. And that's an important discovery. And it leads to many interesting questions. So for example, some phrases transform in this way when looped and others don't. So Adam Tierney has developed a corpus of 24 phrases that tend to transform in this way when you loop them, and 24 matched phrases from the same speakers, same number of syllables, same rates, and so forth, that don't transform when they're looped. Why is that? Well, we looked at this together in a 2018 paper with Mara Breen, and there were some surprising results, including it's not how close syllables pitches are to musical pitches that really determines it. It's other factors. Another question is, why do certain listeners experience the song illusion much more strongly than others? And we've looked at that recently in collaboration with Mara Breen and Kala Yasmin. And it turns out it's not musical training. It's other factors about pitch and rhythm perception. So there's a number of interesting discoveries. And the illusion is useful for cognitive and neural research on speech and music processing. And there are a number of papers on this by multiple groups now. And I just want to point out there's an award-winning paper here at the conference by Anna Heemstra from the University of Amsterdam, who got a Best Student Paper Award for song illusion research. So it's great to see how this research is being carried forward by the next generation. And I just found out that from Adam that Anna's talk is actually already on YouTube, so you can still see that if you'd like. All right, so what I want to focus on today is expectancy in terms of using singing as a way to explore it. And it's a core topic in our field because the formation, fulfillment, and violation of expectancies is important for music's emotional power. And there are many books on this, going back to Leonard Meyer's classic 1956, Emotion and Meaning in Music. I've just listed a few other important books here. David Huron's Sweet Anticipation, Lisa Margulis's On Repeat, Patrick Uslin's Musical Emotions Explained, and so on. It's just a partial list. Now, in terms of expectancy, currently there's a lot of research on rhythmic expectancy in music using instrumental music. And that's very interesting. For example, to study how the motor system generates precise temporal predictions about sound patterns, even in the absence of movement. We know from a number of wonderful neuroimaging studies by people like Jessica Grahn and Virginia Penhune and colleagues that there are a number of motor regions of the brain that are strongly active and interacting when people report perceiving a beat in a rhythm, even if they're not moving or intending to move. Areas like the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex, shown here, and putamen, and so on. So what's going on? Why is the brain expending all this energy on motor activity when you're not moving? A number of people believe that these motor regions are helping predict the timing of beats with high temporal accuracy, even in the absence of overt movement. That's an idea I've reviewed with John Cannon in a recent paper on how beat perception co-ops motor neurophysiology. And John gave a talk on this yesterday at ICMPC. And this has clinical relevance for neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease. But today I want to focus on melodic expectancy using singing. And the original motivation for this work was the question, what is the relationship between language and music processing in the brain? If you think about it, monophonic melodies and sentences are both richly structured sequences perceived one element at a time. And in both cases, we know from plenty of research that listeners form expectations about upcoming elements, just tones or words, and multiple sources of knowledge inform those expectations. For example, phonological, semantic, and syntactic knowledge of one's native language, or knowledge about note transition probabilities, motivic structure, and hierarchical tonal structure in one's native music. So my prediction in language and music employs similar cognitive mechanisms. I hypothesized so in a paper with Emily Morgan in 2017. But to even get started on this question, how do you gather data on musical and linguistic expectancy in comparable ways? The research on musical and linguistic expectation has largely used different methods. So for example, much of the foundational work on melodic expectation uses instrumental music and rating paradigms. You play part of a melody, you stop and you play a probe tone and you ask the listener to rate how well it continues the melody. And Carol Krumhansel has been involved in multiple important studies using that method, including a paper in Cognition that's a cross-cultural paper from 2000. And much foundational work on linguistic expectancy has used the closed probability method. Readers or listeners are presented with the opening of a novel sentence that has a blank at the end, and they're asked to complete it with the first word that comes to mind. So for example, when the two met, one of them held out her blank, and you think of a word, what's the first word that comes to mind? You write it down or you say it. And in these studies, researchers quantify expectancy as the probability of different completions. So for example, here, many people would probably say hand. So in 2015, we developed to try and have some kind of analog to the linguistic closed probability paradigm to do parallel research in language and music. We developed the melodic closed probability paradigm or method. And in this method, it's just conceptually quite simple. Listeners hear the opening of a novel melody and sing the note they think comes next. And doing research on melodic expectancy with singing was not new, but previous singing research to study melodic expectancy had only used sequences of 2 or 3 tones, not coherent melodies. For example, James Carlson's early and pioneering work in this domain. So we had melodic openings of 5 to 9 notes in length. They were composed in pairs in Western European major keys. And members of each pair were matched in rhythm, number of notes, melodic contour, and key strength, and they were played in a piano timbre. And different pairs had different rhythms and melodic contours and so forth. But the key thing was one member of each pair was designed to generate a strong expectation for the tonic via implied harmony or an implied authentic cadence, or AC. The other member was designed not to generate a strong expectation for a particular note, so we call those non-cadence or NC versions of melodic stems. So here are a couple of examples. So here's a non-cadence stem, and we'll just listen to it. And if you're a participant, you would hear this and be asked to sing the note you think might come next. So here you go. You can try this at home. Okay, what would you sing? Well, empirically, people sang a lot of different things. This graph shows the proportion of participants who sang a particular pitch after hearing this stem, and shown in chromatic notes on the bottom in this graph, and then scale degrees. And you can see some people sang the tonic D, other people sang the second scale degree, the fifth scale degree, and so forth, but a lot of variability. And this was 50 participants musically trained. That's the AC stem, the NC stem. The AC version of that pair looks like this and sounds like this. And we have a very different response profile, as you might imagine if you were singing what you thought came next. The vast majority of people in this case sang the tonic. You can just see how different those two distributions are, and all that was changed was 2 notes in this melody. And typically members of a melodic pair differed by just a few notes that were actually very close to each other in pitch. So melodic closed probability data, each AC and NC stem yield a response distribution. And average AC and NC distributions across our 45 pairs were very different. So here's our summary data from the original paper from 2015, the average profile after authentic cadence stems, where people are really likely to sing the tonic, basically, is what happens. And the average profile after non-cadence or NC stems, where people are much more variable in what they sing. And here the stars denote significant differences from the this distribution here. So you can see basically people sing very differently after these two stems, based probably on the implied harmony as one important factor. I should point out in this slide, these chord symbols are just possible harmonizations, and I've given some Roman numerals beneath these. So these are just to show you that kind of what a listener might be perceiving harmonically underneath these sequences, and there's an implied authentic cadence here and not here. Okay. All right, so here's the part about serendipity. So the melodic closed probability method was originally motivated by questions about music-language relations in the mind. But the data allowed us to test models of melodic expectation, which is not why I got into this business, but it turned out to be very interesting and has taken on a life of its own. Testing such models has long been part of our field. There's classic work by Eugene Narmer, including his 1990 book, excuse me, there's a typo on the slide, The Analysis and Cognition of Basic Melodic Structures. Eugene is a music theorist. And I just want to point out, so he proposed the implication realization model, which led to an early model of melodic expectancy that was extensively tested. And I just want to point out to a write-up about the second ICMPC by Justin London, who published this in 1992 in Journal of Musicology about his experience at the conference. And he said, Narmer's work was cited in many papers, but on the final day of the conference, a special session on musical expectancy was devoted to a study of Narmer's implication realization model. With a large body of data and elegant statistical analysis, a group at the University of Washington led by James Carlson tested Narmer's predictions for melodic continuation through the analysis of both subject responses, e.g. giving a singer a 3-note motive and having her continue, as well as by the analysis of a large number of compositions. So you can see that testing models of melodic expectation has been part of our field for a long time. That's a great write-up about that early ICMPC conference, by the way, if you're interested in the history of our field. Okay, and testing the IR model has been important in our field, and tests include Schellenberg's 1996 paper in Cognition, an important paper on that. So we tested models of melodic expectancy with our melodic closed data, and we looked at two models. One was a statistical learning model, the Informational Dynamics of Music model by Marcus Pierce. This is a variable order Markov model for learning n-grams over sequences of musical symbols, and this is trained on corpora of Western tonal music. And it's known from lots of work that the predictions of this model correlate with listener judgments of melodic expectancy, brain responses to unexpected notes, perception of melodic complexity, and there are many really nice papers on this, including a great one by Chung et al. In Current Biology. The other model was a Gestalt model, the probabilistic model of melody perception by David Temperley. And it's a very different model. It's based on just 3 principles. Tendency for pitches to fall in a normally distributed range around a melody's central pitch, tendency for note-to-note intervals to be small, and a tendency for some scale degrees to be more probable than others. And that's probabilities derived from musical corpora. So you train it on particular musical corpora to get those probabilities. It's akin to Narmer's IR model in having a few music theoretically motivated principles, and actually has outperformed the IR model in some tests that Davey has done. It has no note-to-note transition probabilities or n-grams, so it's very different from the idiom model in that respect. And both are computationally implemented, freely available models, which have been very important contributions to our field. So some methods and key findings from our 2019 paper led by Emily Morgan, when we compared these models to human data from melodic close. Both models were trained on the same 2 corpora of Western tonal music. And so we tested them twice after training on each of these corpora. Models were used to compute predictions for the next note after each AC and NC stem, and those predictions were compared to average human response profiles for each stem. And we used data from 2 closed experiments, the original experiment from 2015 that I showed you some data from, and a new version that we did in 2019 with Anjali Nair, where we asked people to complete the melody by singing up to a few notes. to see if this made a difference in the distribution of responses, and basically it didn't. We were concerned about whether asking them to sing one note might lead people to want to try and finish the melody as opposed to continue it. So basically for NC stems, the average model predictions reflected average human data fairly well, and you can see that in this graph. This is the non-cadence data. This is human data from experiment 1 and from experiment 2, but we're always looking at the first note they sang after the stem, even though in experiment 2 they sang multiple notes. And these are the predictions of the idiom and temporally models. And these are the different scale degrees, and these are the average plots for the predictions for NC or non-cadence melodies. And as you can see, the human data are somewhat resembled by the idiom and temporally data here. But for the AC stems, things were different. Here was our first surprise. Both models severely underpredicted the tonic compared to human responses. So here are human data after the AC stems. Again, this strong bias to sing the tonic versus other scale degrees, which is not really captured by either model. There's some tendency for it but not nearly what we see in humans. So basically, participants were far more sensitive to underlying harmonic structure than either model was. So that was one of the key findings. Another surprise from that study was that even for the NC stems, where the models seem to be doing pretty well, if you look at them closely, model predictions for specific melodies often had about 40% of the probability mass in the wrong place. Now, why is that? Well, using the Morgan et al. Supplementary information, you can listen to and examine each melodic stem and compare human expectations to model predictions in order to understand why humans and models diverged. And this has yet to be done systematically for all our melodies, but I'll just pull out one to give you an idea of what you might learn from doing this. So here's one melody, one melodic stem, and I'll just play it for you. And here's the graph showing the different distributions. The red are the human responses, and the blue are the idiom responses trained on 2 different corpora, and the green are the template responses trained on 2 different corpora. And the important thing to notice here is that the models are correctly predicting this pitch, G4, as a sung pitch, but many participants continue this melody with B flat 3, and neither model did. Now, why might that be? Well, we can sort of graph what's happening here, and you can sort of maybe get a sense of why this is happening. So in a sense, the G4 is a logical continuation of this B flat and A, but the B flat 3 is a logical continuation of this D and C in this lower kind of melodic stream. And neither of the models got that. So it suggests that one reason for some of the model's prediction errors is that neither model incorporates principles of auditory streaming, which are one of the principles of auditory scene analysis in this very influential and wonderful book from Al Bregman, Auditory Scene Analysis. So we then did a model comparison in this 2019 paper, and we found that both models accounted for unique variance in human melodic closed data. Idiom accounted for somewhat more variance than Temperley's model, suggesting that statistical learning may play a slightly larger role in human melodic expectation than Gestalt-like principles. But it really points to a need for model pluralism on research in melodic expectancy, that is, combining multiple models that focus on distinct cognitive mechanisms rather than trying to pick one model as the winner. And also a need for models that are sensitive to higher level patterning in melodies. For example, underlying chord structure in Western European tonal melodies. And it's very likely, actually, that this kind of underlying higher level melodic structure varies across cultures. And this could actually be studied with melodic close because the task is fairly easy to understand. In fact, in conversations with Nori, he thinks this task would work pretty well with the Tsimane, who are very distant from urbanized Western culture because it's fairly simple to explain. Listen to this melody and sing the note that you think comes next. And he's gotten singing research to work in this population. And so we have a prediction that if Nori were to do this experiment with the Tsimane, there would be many fewer tonic responses to AC stems because they don't have the enculturation in Western tonal music to develop those sensitivities to implied harmony that Western listeners have. So, of course, you can also turn the camera around and use melodic close to study Westerners' processing of non-Western music. So for example, to take a stimulus from this nice paper by Jiang, Liu, and Wang, where they studied responses to Western and Indian classical music, not with melodic close, but for other reasons. You could play melodies like this to a Western listener and ask them to sing the note they think comes next. Okay, so you can, there are plenty of Westerners who have very little knowledge of non-Western music, so you can study how other music cultures and their hierarchical systems are or are not perceived by Western listeners. And for students interested in cross-cultural research, just a quick couple of notes. There's a symposium today on global diversity in music cognition, I think right after this keynote. There are a couple of neat resources. There's a 2019 chapter by Thompson, Yun, and Fritz that I think is really excellent, called Music Across Cultures, from this book, Foundations in Music Psychology, an edited volume. And there's a paper in press by Pat Savage and colleagues on building sustainable collaborative networks with recommendations for cross-cultural research that's available on SciArchive. And I think this is a rich area of research that is essential for understanding diversity and commonality in human musicality in terms of the future. Okay, so let's turn to some current work on using melodic close. So Niels Vorosky and Emily Morgan have a paper in Press in Cognitive Science, which is available on SciArchive, where they use closed data to test a new model of melodic expectancy called expectation networks, developed by Niels in a 2019 paper. And the basic intuition is that scale degrees that reliably occur near each other in sequences, but not necessarily in immediate succession, can drive melodic expectancy. So here's a quote from the paper. Pitch classes, represented as chromatic scale degrees, are associated according to their tendency to appear in close temporal succession, in a direct analogy to neural learning that can be summarized colloquially by saying that pitches that fire together, wire together. It's a nice metaphor for this model. And basically, the idea is that if you think of pitches as points in kind of a network, you may have cases where, say, for example, 5 often goes to 1, but not always immediately. Maybe sometimes it goes via 2 or via 2, 4, and then to 1. And it can develop associations with 1 over distances, not just because it goes to 1 immediately. So Niels and Emily trained idiom, temporally, and EXP nets on the same corpora and compared their melodic predictions to the Fogel et al. Melodic close data. It turned out that all 3 models explained significant and unique variance in the human data, with the expectation nets explaining a bit more than other models. But this really enforces the need for model pluralism, that is, models that capture parallel and distinct cognitive mechanisms in melodic expectancy, and finding ways to combine those models rather than thinking that one is going to be the best compared to others. And sometimes one outperforms others, but they all seem to contribute uniquely. And like other models, EXP nets underpredict the tonic and AC stems, as you can see in this data, where you see the human responses for AC stems, again plotted in this time as a line, and the model predictions for idiom in blue, expectation networks in red, and temporally in green. And all models, again, really underpredict the tonic. And when they make a combined model, these 3 models, that model still makes numerous errors, including putting about 1/3 of the probability mass in the wrong place for NC melodies. So there's lots of room for other models. So turning to some other work using melodic close, Nori Jacobi and Luke Patel have worked up an online version of melodic close. This is a very non-trivial accomplishment because it includes automatic pitch tracking and being able to do things remotely. And the tools, once finalized, will be available to the research community. So it's a very valuable contribution that I think will help drive research forward. And it allows us to answer interesting questions. For example, to what extent does melodic expectation depend on melodic training? So remember that in the Fogel et al. And Morgan et al. Studies, the data was from musically trained participants. So just to remind you, here's the Fogel et al. Data, the average response distribution for AC stems and NC stems. But these were musically trained individuals. Would we see this kind of difference in response profiles for these 2 kinds of stems for musically untrained individuals? So Nori and Luke ran this online, collecting data from musicians and non-musicians. The musicians defined as people with greater than 5 years of daily practice who self-identified as musicians, and non-musicians as people with less than 3 years of daily practice who identified as non-musicians. And here are the results. For the authentic cadence and the non-cadence and NC stems. You can see for the NC stems, the 2 groups look pretty similar. And for the AC stems, you still get a preponderance of tonic responses, even in non-musicians, but fewer tonic responses. And so it seems here that non-musicians seem less sensitive to implied harmony, which fits with previous music cognition work, including by Psyche Louis and David Wessel. But nevertheless, they still show some sensitivity, which makes sense because we know non-musicians are sensitive to cadences, even if they've had no musical training. Okay, and then finally, some other work using melodic close returns to the theme of music-language relations. And this is what I'll end with. Going back to the question that kind of got melodic close started, which is, might prediction in language and music employ similar cognitive mechanisms? And you can actually examine this by studying autism, because it's hypothesized, autism is hypothesized to have abnormal predictive mechanisms, or to be associated with abnormal predictive mechanisms. A nice review of this was just published in Autism Research by John Cannon and Pawan Sinha and colleagues. And here's a quote from the abstract. An important goal for future research will be to better define and constrain the broad domain general hypothesis by testing multiple types of prediction within the same individuals. That domain general hypothesis of a prediction impairment. So Fang Liu and colleagues used the melodic close task and a matched linguistic close task to compare musical and linguistic prediction in autistic and neurotypical individuals. And I just want to point out that Leo and colleagues have several presentations on music processing and autism at ICMPC, including one at 1300 UTC today. So the participants were children, actually, in Nanchang and Nanjing, China. And here's a table with some demographic information. And it's I just want to throw it up there because I want to point out the careful matching that, that this group did in terms of musical training, nonverbal IQ, receptive vocabulary, and digit span. So it's a nicely controlled comparative study with about 30 children in each group, around 10 or 11 years old. And I'm going to just give the main results, which is captured in the title of the paper we're writing up now: impaired linguistic prediction, but intact musical prediction in autism spectrum disorder. So the autistic kids looked quite normal in their musical prediction, but abnormal in their linguistic prediction. And that suggests that musical prediction is distinct from linguistic prediction in this group. And that result challenges the hypothesis that Emily Morgan and I put forward in 2017, but it may support a recent proposal about music-language neurocognitive relations, just published by Ria Sano and colleagues in Cognition, in terms of their coordinated hierarchical control hypothesis. So I encourage you to look at that very interesting paper, which just came out. And the question that I'm wondering about as we move forward with this autism work is if some of the mechanisms underlying music and language expectancy are analogous, but they occur in distinct brain circuits, could circuits doing musical prediction perhaps be retrained for linguistic prediction through mechanisms of neural plasticity? We know from other work in music neuroscience, like the work of Gottfried Schlag, that sometimes after stroke, areas involved in music cognition can get recruited and retrained for language cognition through therapies that use music and language together. So I'm intrigued by that idea. Okay, so just to summarize what I've told you today, a singing-based method, melodic close, provides a new way to study melodic expectation using coherent, naturalistic melodic openings, in which musical structure is manipulated to study specific factors driving expectancy. Testing models of melodic expectation with closed data suggests expectancy is driven by diverse cognitive factors like statistical learning, Gestalt-like principles, and non-adjacent tonal associations. But even with the current state-of-the-art models that we're testing, much variance in human melodic expectation remains unexplained. So there's certainly a need for further models, including models that are sensitive to implied harmony or other higher-level patterns of melody in a culture. And I think that model pluralism is really important for future work, building combined models that address different factors that govern melodic expectation. Melodic close can be used in online and cross-cultural research, and it can be used to study cognitive relations between musical and linguistic prediction in normal and clinical populations. And I think that's a neat area because it has possible clinical implications. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.
Simulate applause if people can hear this. Okay, so you're getting a lot of emojis. If you stop, maybe if you stop sharing your screen, you can see that. Annie, can you see that?
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for this wonderful talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I have questions, but before that, let's just go to our first question. And Niels Christian Hansen has actually two fairly long, comments and questions. I think it's better you read them because those two are pretty long. So I'll let you answer.
Okay.
Yeah,
hello, Neil. Nice to see you. Thanks for sharing these important results and thoughts. I'm not convinced of your criticism of Pearson temporal models based on closed data averaged across participants. The models estimate expectancy for individual participants, whereas closed data provide 1 point per participant. Okay, so that's an interesting point. Yes, so we are using closed data to generate profiles for individual melodies, individual AC and NC stems. And you're right, any participant sings one continuation, and then we get a distribution. And so there are different ways of thinking about this. One could be that that distribution sort of represents an underlying sort of mental distribution that listeners have, and that they pick probabilistically from that distribution when they produce a sung note. We talk a bit about this in the original melodic 2019 paper. But yes, there's some ways of thinking about how those distributions might get transformed when singers produce the notes that they produce. For example, do they tend to exaggerate the most probable note that comes out of those distributions? And that's something that could be studied. In fact, that's exactly, if you extract the pitch with the highest probability, I think you would get very low entry reduced pitch. Okay, so yes, there are different ways to transform and those distributions and to think about what listeners was doing. I think you would just need to find some way to find evidence that people are doing those sorts of transformations on underlying distributions, which is a separate and interesting question, but thank you. But I encourage you to take a look at the Morgan paper because we do talk about that a bit. And then the more recent paper by Emily, I think, may get into this as well. I guess I'll just keep reading the questions. Hello, John McBride. You say that the three models all account for unique variance. Is there some obvious systematic way that they vary in their predictions? That's a great question. I don't think there's an obvious systematic way. I think the thing to do that I just barely touched on in this talk that I think would be really interesting, especially for music theorists, is to look at individual melodic stems and look at the predictions that are made by the models and then by humans and see where they diverge and try to come up with some systematic reasons for the divergences we see across melodies. So I think there's a way to go after that question. Hello, Kai Seidenberg. Thanks, Annie. I love live presentations. To which extent might a production perception gap play a role? That's an interesting question. And there certainly are dissociations between production and perception, and sometimes they don't always reflect each other. Emily Morgan is actually now running a perception version of melodic close in the traditional form where people listen to stems and then hear different possible continuations and rate different continuations for how well they think they continue the melody. So we'll be able to address that question empirically, hopefully soon, or Emily will. Okay, right, and Peter has some interesting things about things you could look at in models, which I agree with, different things. The only contest I ever, Andrea, thank you for sharing. The only contest I ever won at a long ago music psych conference, and the challenge was to write the most boring melody, and it got you a bottle of wine. I wonder if melody creation using constraints for novelty or boringness could be useful to capture. Oh, that's a great question, Andrea. And in fact, Anjali Nair, who did her undergraduate thesis using melodic close on the study where people continued with up to several notes, that turned out to be a super interesting study because it turned out to be a neat way to study improvisation, essentially, because people heard the opening of a melody and then they just continued it until they were done. And we found a few interesting things. For example, people sang fewer notes after AC stems than NC stems, as you might expect. But people produced some very creative and interesting things, and it was a simple way to study improvisation and the structures people produce when they create melodies spontaneously, even among people who would never call themselves musical improvisers. So I think the melodic close paradigm has some hope for looking at improvisation as well. Katie, could you say anything more about, hi Katie, Overy, could you say anything more about the selection criteria for music included in the model, the corpora used? Oh yes, I'm sorry I didn't get into that, but please look at the 2019 paper. There was the Essen corpus and the Pierce-Wiggins corpus, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. Essen is a folk song database, and Pierce-Wiggins includes a few different musical styles and a few different cultures. But I agree that looking at training the models on different corpora and larger corpora would be an important thing to do in the future. Hello, Elizabeth Phillips. Similar to John's comment, the example you showed is relying more on melodic streaming and leaps, which is statistically quite rare and might explain why idiom didn't work as well. Could close analysis of the melodies predict which cognitive? Yes, that's exactly what I was hoping to get across. And I think you can download the supplementary information from the Morgan paper, look at each melody, listen to each melody, look at the human responses, look at the model responses, melody by melody, see where they're converging and where they're diverging to try and get some insight into what the models are doing differently from humans. Music theory systems probably don't have a single tonic. Hello, Roger, Dean. Also, machine learning models do not depend on one theoretical principles, but may reveal all of them. Yes, well, that's a good point. And certainly, there can be musical systems that don't have to have a single tonic. We, in our particular stimuli, by using authentic cadences, it seemed to have guided people towards a tonic, at least in this system that we looked at, but there could be other systems that work in different ways. Hello, Paolo Amarante. Is there a role for the singability of the tonic and participants overwhelmingly choosing that tonic? Oh, that's a good question. So I should point out that the melodies were created in two different pitch ranges, one for men and one for women. So we tried to accommodate two comfortable pitch ranges. And I think you could get at this question empirically by actually just looking at collecting some spontaneous singing from each individual, getting their pitch range, their comfortable pitch range, and then pitch shifting all the melodies into their comfortable pitch range. Just because if everything is in MIDI, you can do that on the fly. So you could actually address that question empirically, which I think is a good question. Pat likes the idea of expanding the work cross-culturally. How challenging it would be to expand beyond a 12-tone equal temperament scale paradigm, especially with singing, given that Ford, Rush, and others have shown imprecise singing is widespread? That's a great question. I would love to see this paradigm tried with other tonal systems, including Indian music and North Indian or South Indian classical music, other folk music traditions, small traditions, music from small cultures, music with more than 12 tones per octave, microtones and so forth. It just hasn't been tried. It's kind of an open frontier. It's an interesting question. Shantala, interesting to know further how linguistic expectations, yes, thank you. In multilinguals, yes, what an interesting question. Whether the extent to which musical and linguistic expectation are related in the brain depends on whether or not you speak more than one language. Great question. Michelle Phillips, well, thank you very much, Michelle. Klaus Fryer, hello, Klaus. Do you think that the model's failure are related to some arbitrary underdetermined way of calculating actual numbers? There's no general accepted way to combine expected. Yeah, that's a good point. So please look at the Vorosky and Morgan model. They spend some time on how they interpolate between these models, but that's an important point. Thank you for pointing that out. Oh, good question from Ronnie Grunow. Hello, Ronnie. Do you test if completions are stable if you test people more than once? No, and that's a really interesting and important question, I think, especially in light of testing the idea that people may be sampling from some underlying distribution that we're tapping into with these melodic closed paradigms. Could there be a difference in function of personality, novelty syncing? Well, that's an empirical and interesting question. Okay. And Cienta de los Santos, do you have experiences researching Indians from Brazil? I don't, but I just wanted to point out that Nori Jacobi did all of that work with the Chamane in Brazil, with the two tones work that challenged octave equivalence and so on. And he and I think that the melodic closed paradigm would probably work with that population and with other small scale populations. All right, we did it in 45 minutes.
Well, there's one more, and I also have one question.
Oh, yes, okay.
Quick in a minute.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm further curious to understand the relationship between melodic expectation and other non-linguistic cognitive processes and its implication for neuropsychological rehabilitation. Thank you for that question. So yes, as you probably are all aware, prediction is a huge theme in current cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, the idea that we have internal models that we use to guide our perception of the world and make predictions about incoming information. And a really important question is to what extent predictive mechanisms in different domains are drawing on different cognitive and neural mechanisms, as opposed to just having one generic prediction system in the brain. I looked at that through melodic and linguistic expectancy, but maybe melodic expectancy is related to other kinds of prediction that we do that are not musical, but are also not linguistic. So thank you for that question. Yes, and Nori just popped his paper in the chat using singing to study octave equivalence and so forth. All right.
So I'm going to ask one last question, if I may. So since you've studied, basically you've studied adults, right? So I wondered if you think of studying children, because they're fairly untouched by any sort of, knowledge of, let's say, Western tonality, or even if it's Indian tonality, right? So, and of course, you could possibly pick those kids who have a higher musical aptitude, either by using Nina Krause's approach of looking at the FFR, and some way of identifying that, and then see how they do it. So that maybe gives a new perspective. So I'm just asking.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think developmental studies are going to be very interesting. I should point out that the Fang Liu and her team did study children in the study I mentioned at the end of the talk, the study of autistic and neurotypical children in China. And so she showed it could be done. Of course, children sing with much less pitch accuracy than adults. But you can also, divide children according to their musical aptitude. And so, like you mentioned, you can look at those with different degrees of musical aptitude. So I'm quite curious. Those were 10 and 11-year-olds, and we got some, I think, meaningful data out of that. I'm actually quite curious how young one could go with this paradigm. Nori tells me from his work in the field with the Chimane that the children often enjoy participating in the singing kind of experiments. And so maybe this is something that would port well to children, even in other cultures, because the task seems fairly intuitive. So I think that's a developmental music cognition is an area where this paradigm could help us look at the development of melodic expectancy and the factors underlying it.
So, well, we do have two more comments if you would like to do that, and then we can close the session because they keep coming. So,
okay.
Yes.
So questions here. I love this. So, Elizabeth Phillips, thank you for this question. Would you expect any difference if the melodic stems were presented in a vocal timbre to match the responses, especially singing face to face? What an interesting question. So yeah, that would be a great study to try, because we know, for example, people seem to remember melodies better if they're presented in a vocal timbre than, say, an instrument timbre. So there are reasons to expect perhaps differences depending on whether you do all of this in a vocal timbre. I think that would be a lovely experiment to try. And I want to go back to one question from David Schroth. Interested to see if anybody's beginning to look for melodic expectancy in non-human singing animals. Birdsong would give them great calls, or even if this is theoretically possible. How interesting. Yeah, that would be fascinating to look at other species in terms of melodic expectancy. I have to think about how one would do that. Because we have access to their songs, but how do we get them to continue a song with what they expect to come next? Or maybe that's not the right way to think about it, but this is a very interesting question, and I'd be happy to talk about that further with you, David. And then finally, Niels again, would closed paradigm results differ if participants sang along with the beginning of the melody? Jumping in the middle is perhaps not a maximally realistic thing to do. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I mean, these are novel melodies. So you could allow people to sing along as soon as they want, is when they start hearing the melody, and that might be an interesting thing to do as well. And that might reveal another set of interesting results, like which melodies do people predict online better than others and track better with their singing than others, novel melodies and so forth. So there would be another way to use the paradigm. So again, the questions show how things can go in ways that you never expected. So, all right, thank you so much, Vinu and everybody. It's been great to be here with you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aniruddh. This was a wonderful talk, and it was so great to have someone speak live. And of course, we could have had everyone speak live, but just the sheer number of contributions wouldn't have been possible. But thank you so much. And thank you all for participating and for the wonderful questions and discussion, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much, Aniruddh.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.